I didn't see it as my shift had ended 2 hours before, but a guy in my shop was operating a 15-ton overhead crane in our large pole building, and a maintenance guy was talking to him while he was bringing the chain and hooks up with the lift. Operator wasn't paying attention and didn't see one of the hooks was stuck on something. When the operator went to look over, the hook slipped and shot straight up and ripped his face in half, from chin to forehead, and it shattered his hard hat. He was taken immediately to the hospital and underwent surgery. He returned full health to work like 3 months later. Couldn't even tell anything had happened. I didn't see it as my shift had ended 2 hours before, but a guy in my shop was operating a 15-ton overhead crane in our large pole building, and a maintenance guy was talking to him while he was bringing the chain and hooks up with the lift. Operator wasn't paying attention and didn't see one of the hooks was stuck on something. When the operator went to look over, the hook slipped and shot straight up and ripped his face in half, from chin to forehead, and it shattered his hard hat. He was taken immediately to the hospital and underwent surgery. He returned full health to work like 3 months later. Couldn't even tell anything had happened. Another one I saw a video of is when an inexperienced crane operator took control for a 20-ton overhead crane in our mid-sized building. He wasn't trained and started moving the crane, which eventually grabbed another smaller jib crane and ripped it out of the wall, sending it down on a machine that's roughly $2 million. The operator of that machine not only barely escaped in a Scooby-Doo type fashion, but also had to be held down by like 3 to 4 other guys, as he was actually going to kill the guy who almost killed him. Some fucker decided to run out onto the R floor, and the robots with shelves made a beeline for him and crushed his leg. Work in a case-ready meat facility. One guy apparently neglected to use skinning gloves, think those yellow dishwashing ones, but 10x as thick, harder material. Had the guide set too thick and his arm was pulled into the machine. His hand was partially degloved up to the wrist, out of work for 6 months. After the incident, you would catch hell from absolutely anyone nearby if you said you could run the machine faster without the gloves. Company. Maintenance had shut down machine to work on it. New supervisor notices lockout tag isn't correctly on, so he figured he'd turn it back on. The maintenance guy was standing inside an area where a pressure piston was being rebuilt. Before he knew it, he had his lung punctured and couldn't call for help. About 3 minutes into it, the machine jams due to it being partially disassembled. Maintenance manager gets upset and goes to see the issue and discovers the poor maintenance guy full of pain and tears leaning on machinery. Thank God for cameras. The supervisor tried to say there was no lockout tag, but security cameras said differently. My friend's brother was working on a textile machine that pulled blankets up about 14 feet through rollers and across another 10 feet, where it dropped it into a bin on the other side. His watch got caught and his arm tangled up in the blanket, and he was pulled up and through both rollers. It crushed his ribs and shattered his shoulder and right arm, but would have killed him if he didn't weigh 120 pounds. A lawyer contacted him, but he refused to sue his employer. A man was cutting a strip of rubber and didn't cut it all the way through the end and decided to pull it to break it without putting his knife back. Knife went into his eye. Same place, a man was walking through the steam area. There were grates in the floor, but he couldn't see that someone had moved one of the grates, and he fell into waist-deep boiling water. I don't remember how long he was down there. Same place, a guy always put a can of ravioli just outside of the oven so it would be hot in the can by his lunch. He got busy one day and ended up taking his lunch a couple hours later. Went to open the can and it exploded in his face. He had third-degree chemical burns to his face and torso. Same building, the safety rep put his hand down on a roller belt and it popped his thumb off. Same place, a guy was sticking his hand into a chopper/mixer looking machine that blended the powders and chemicals together and was dodging the mixing blade. I can't remember if he tripped or what, but the chopper mixer thing came down on the back of his hand and sucked it in and degloved his hand. At a barge unloading facility, a tugboat had a pilot and 2 deckhands. One of the deckhands fell off the back of the tug and was floating there in his life jacket. The other deckhand signaled the pilot to stop. The way to stop a boat is to reverse the propeller. As soon as the pilot reversed the propeller, the deckhand floating at the rear of the boat was sucked into the propeller. Part of the investigation was an emphasis in training to make sure that everyone understood when to use the stop hand sign and when to use the cut engine hand sign. Every time another piece of the deckhand who fell off the boat was found, my boss had to call his widow and tell her. He told me that he was going to make sure he never had to do that again. Not myself, but I had a friend that worked at a company that packages and wrapped up item, and one time a dude got stuck in the machine and plastic wrap got wrapped around his head and he suffocated to death. Not a factory but a distribution center I worked at, saw a coworker stick his hand in the conveyor belt to grab a label he dropped. It caught something on his arm and degloved his hand from just above the wrist down to the middle of his fingers. I work in a massive heavy-duty truck engine plant. There's a machine in the 3,000,000 plus square foot facility that's about the size of a large house. It takes raw engine blocks from the foundry and they come out a while later basically ready to be assembled. Years back we had our technician for that shift go in for confined space maintenance and he didn't lock out the colossal mechanical monster all the way, of course not thinking it entirely necessary. A few minutes after when he worked his way decently far inside, part of the machine started cycling automatically. Everyone's blood ran cold when he started making noise. His head was caught between two large moving parts, presumably the 2,000 plus pound engine blocks, and he suffered the entire time until his death, almost 10 minutes. He was still screaming when his head was 2 inches wide. Took most of a day to dismantle the thing enough to get what was left of him out. It's one of less than 5 such accidents in the last 2 decades, but in the near century the place has been in business. There have been plenty of other nightmarish events for sure. Nothing ever happened, but I'm really glad I got out of there before anything did. I worked a slitter machine with large rollers that would slit down huge rolls of paper that would weigh thousands of pounds. We worked alone, not enough people to have more than one person on the machine at a time, tucked away in the very back corner of the plant, and on top of that, work swing shifts, and we were constantly exhausted to the point of some of the other guys falling asleep on their shifts. Corporate was giving a guided tour to a group of school kids, a great idea for an educational field trip. There were parents there to act as chaperones, but it was pretty obvious that they didn't understand how potentially dangerous everything could be. This one kid somehow managed to fall into a food-grade mixing vat and had to get pulled out by some of my co-workers. It was a complete mess. They were escorted out while the rest of the group continued on. Did they learn? No. Of course not. A bit later, after being warned not to touch any of the products, one girl grabbed a small bit off a conveyor belt because it just looked so good and wanted to try it. Joke's on her though, she ate her sample and apparently she was allergic. She had a massive reaction. Almost instantly her face started swelling up and lips were turning blue. It was wild and scary AF. A couple of co-workers rushed her out to get medical attention. Corporate continued to give warnings about how potentially dangerous everything was if not shown the proper respect for the equipment and everything. And almost instantly another whiny, entitled brat climbed onto a testing platform. The automated door opened and the dumbass fell into a duct. Workers pulled her out and took her to the office to check her out and make sure she hadn't broken anything. These kids were complete hellions and the adults with them had zero control. There were only like 2 kids and a few adults left on the tour. I don't get paid enough to deal with stupid shit like that. My shift ended and I left, but one of my buddies at the factory told me later that one of the last 2 kids goofed off in our R&D lab and nearly got himself killed. Luckily he only had minuscule injuries. They ended the tour after that. Corporate dude just golf. But man, all of those kids were complete asshats. There was only one kid and what looked like his grandfather left from the original group. My buddy in security showed me video a few days later that kid stealing something from a processing room. With his gramps. The real fucked up part of all of this was that after they had finished the tour, the owner of the company offered to give the last kid the entire fucking company. Like WTF? I mean, I guess since his name was all over it he was looking at this ocean nightmare of having multiple kids injured that could have been killed, and he lost his shit. He tried to give the company and the entire candy factory to some kid. My guess is to make it look like he was mentally unstable so once this blew up and went to court he'd have a way out for all of the charges for obvious negligence. Sure, all of the people/kids on the tour had signed waivers and shit, but there are definitely some safety protocols that weren't in place that should have been. Anyway, that was a fucked up day. I quit a few days later cause I wasn't going down with that sinking dumpster fire. Got a job at a local competitor. They offered me a big pay increase. I think they're hoping I can bring some of my insider knowledge on some stuff from my old place. I'm glad I'm out of there. Haha, maybe I should be posting this under r/anti-work. That company was a complete shit show. What owner thinks it's a great marketing idea to hide 5 tickets in your candy products to give children an exclusive, behind-the-scenes tour to a factory? This is a production facility, not an amusement park. Kids don't belong back here with all the dangerous machines, chemicals, everything. They're lucky that one kid didn't end up dead in the incinerator. My grandfather worked for Reynolds Metal back in the late 70s/early 80s. He was walking to lunch with a buddy one day when someone called out to his friend. The friend stopped walking and my grandfather continued on. A bunch of raw steel was being craned around, but it wasn't strapped properly and ended up falling on my grandfather. It was over 1 ton of metal, and it basically folded him in half. They removed the metal as quickly as they could, and one of his co-workers demanded they med-flight him to a specific hospital, instead of just taking him to the closest hospital. That decision saved his life. They weren't sure if he was going to survive or not. He was in a coma for a short while, and one day a nurse was checking on him. She was just talking to him, not expecting him to respond, and she asked, "Would you like anything?" And the old man said, "Yeah, I'd like a Budweiser." He had to retire on disability, but he survived and lived for another 30 years. He was the toughest person I've ever known. I didn't know the guy, nor was I around, but my old lady's friend was cleaning the bottom of a grain bin, and the blade somehow got turned on. He was cut clean in half and basically blended. He was either 15 or 16. Can't imagine what his parents are going through knowing how brutal his death was. Happened a long time ago, but I'm sure they still have visions of what it could look like in their nightmares. Not a factory, but I worked at a bagel store in the 90s. Girl was slicing bagels with the automatic slicer, a torture device that had a spinning razor blade inside to slice cleanly. It was covered, but the marmalade bagels would stick. One stuck, and rather than tossing a waste bagel down, she stuck her hand in. The next thing we heard was a shriek followed by blood everywhere. We had to close for the day and have a hazmat team clean the blood up. I believe the fingers were cut so cleanly off they were able to reattach. My great-grandfather worked with his dad at a blacksmith in the late 1800s, when he was a teenager. I don't know what piece of equipment did it, but his left arm was ripped off at the shoulder. They rushed him and his arm to a surgeon, who asked them why they'd bring the arm. They didn't really do limb reattachments at the time, but my great-grandfather's dad begged the surgeon until he agreed to at least try. It ended up being a success, making my great-grandfather one of the earlier cases of successful limb reattachment surgeries. Worked at a prison over 15 plus years ago. I'm an RN. Went to a call at the warehouse outside the fence. Outside contractor came to work on the dock plate. Propped it up with a 2x4 which broke and the dock plate came down on his head. We tried to do CPR but he had stopped breathing when we got there. Inmates had found him and talked to him / held his hand so he wasn't alone.